For 2,000 years, philosophers, theologians, and scientists have tried to map the human interior. They built systems, nomenclatures, models, and they arrived at conclusions completely opposed to one another. But while the debate continued, the answer was buried in the Hebrew of Genesis, in a word that most Bibles translate in a generic way, and that changes everything when you understand what it really means. Before any theological discussion, there is a linguistic problem that very few people know about. Modern Bibles translate two completely distinct terms with the same word. Nephesh and Ruach in Hebrew appear hundreds of times in the Old Testament. In translations into Portuguese, the two frequently become the same word: spirit, soul, breath, life breath. The distinction disappears in translation, and with it, one of the deepest layers of understanding about what the biblical authors really wanted to communicate. This is not a minor detail. Nephesh appears 755 times in the Old Testament. Ruach appears 389 times. Together, these two words describe completely different realities within the human structure. And the distinction between them is not merely academic. It is, according to the sacred texts, the difference between what you share with an animal and what no animal has ever had. To understand the debate, you need to go back to the exact moment when the biblical authors describe the creation of the human being. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. The scene is simple on the surface. God forms man from the dust of the ground, breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, and man becomes a living soul. Three elements, three distinct components, and each of them has a technical name in the original Hebrew that practically no translation preserves with precision. The first element is afar, the dust of the ground. It is the material, physical dimension, the body. The third element, the result, is described as nephesh chaya, living soul. But the second element, what God breathes, is called nishmat chayim, the breath of life. And here the complexity begins, because this breath, this nishma, is closely related to another term, ruach, the spirit. All three terms, nephesh, ruach, and nishma, orbit the same semantic sphere, but describe realities sufficiently distinct that the biblical authors themselves use them in radically different contexts. The Apostle Paul, writing in Greek to the community at Thessalonica, articulated the matter with a clarity that 3 decades of philosophical debate could not surpass. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 23, he writes, "And the very God of peace sanctify you wholly. And I pray God your whole spirit and soul and body be preserved blameless." 3 distinct words, pneuma, psyche, and soma, spirit, soul, and body. Paul was not being redundant. He was describing 3 layers of existence that he considered genuinely separate, each with its own function, each with its own vulnerability. This perspective received a name in later theological discussions: trichotomy. The view that the human being is composed of 3 distinct parts, body, soul, and spirit, and that each of these parts functions differently, has a different nature, and a different destiny. Against it, an alternative view dominated much of Reformed Protestant thought: dichotomy. The idea that soul and spirit are at bottom the same thing, and that the human being is composed of only 2 dimensions, the material and the immaterial. The debate is not new. Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century defended a version of trichotomy. Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century leaned toward dichotomy. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century built upon Aristotle a synthesis that attempted to resolve the tension without actually resolving it. In each generation, distinct thinkers reached distinct conclusions from the same texts, which suggests the question is genuinely complex, and that perhaps the complexity itself is part of the answer. To understand what nephesh, the soul, really designates in the biblical texts, you need to trace how the word is used in different contexts. This linguistic methodology, called lexical analysis, reveals something surprising. The word nephesh is not used only for human beings. It is used for fish, birds, and land animals. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 20, when God creates the aquatic creatures, the Hebrew text uses the expression nephesh chaya, the same expression used for the human being in Genesis 2, verse 7. The same word, the same compound. In verses 21 and 24, the expression is repeated for birds and land animals. Animals have nephesh. They have what most Bibles translate as soul. This is precisely what confounded Greek and medieval philosophers who tried to incorporate the biblical concept within their philosophical systems. In the Platonic tradition, the soul was what differentiated the human from the animal. If animals also have nephesh, the entire scheme needed adjustment. Aristotle had proposed 3 types of soul: vegetative for plants, sensitive for animals, and rational for humans. Thomas Aquinas worked with this structure, but it does not fit the biblical Hebrew, which uses a single word for the inner dimension of fish, birds, and human beings. What nephesh describes, tracing its use throughout the Old Testament, is the dimension of individual, conscious existence. It is the center of personality, of emotions, of desires, of the specific identity of each being. It is what makes you yourself and not another person. It is the seat of love, of hatred, of joy, of grief, of appetite, of fear. When David writes in the Psalms that his soul is dry as a land without water, he is speaking of a deep, personal, unmistakable emotional dimension. When the prophets use nephesh in declarations such as every living soul, they include both humans and animals, because the dimension of individual conscious existence, of subjective experience of the world, apparently crosses species. The question that the biblical Hebrew raises then is not whether animals have something resembling an inner dimension. It is what exactly differentiates the human interior from the animal interior. And the answer, in the texts of the Old Testament, has a specific name: ruach. Ruach, in Hebrew, has a broader semantic field than any single translation can capture. The word means wind, breath, spirit. It appears in the first verse of Genesis, when the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. It appears in Ezekiel, when God breathes over the dry bones and they come to life. It appears in Job, when Elihu declares that the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding. It appears in Ecclesiastes, when the preacher meditates on the final destiny of every being. The body returns to dust, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. This last reference, in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 7, is one of the most cited in discussions about the nature of the human spirit. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. The Hebrew uses ruach, and the verb return presupposes an origin. The spirit does not simply dissipate, does not simply extinguish, it returns. This implies that the dimension the text calls ruach has, within the biblical scheme, a specific relationship with God that nephesh does not necessarily share in the same way. While nephesh describes the subjective, emotional, personal experience, ruach describes something different. It is the dimension that is oriented vertically. It is the capacity for spiritual perception, for consciousness of transcendence, for responsiveness to the divine. The evangelical theologian Gordon Fee described it thus: nephesh is the self that experiences the horizontal world, relationships, emotions, desires, individual identity. Ruach is the self that has the potential for vertical experience, perception of God, capacity for worship, responsiveness to the sacred. Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 11, articulates something that only makes sense within the trichotomous framework. He writes that no one knows the things of a man except the spirit of the man which is in him. And in the same way, no one knows the things of God except the Spirit of God. The comparison is deliberate. There is a human spirit that knows the depths of the human. There is a divine spirit that knows the depths of God. And communication between them is possible because there is an affinity between their natures. In Romans chapter 8, verse 16, Paul is even more direct. The Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. Two spirits, one human, one divine, in contact. The structure of the sentence makes no sense if the human spirit were merely another word for soul, or for mind, or for emotion. Paul is describing a specific communication between a dimension of the human being and a dimension of God. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12 is perhaps the most cited text in discussions about the separation between soul and spirit. The author writes that the Word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow. The language is surgical, division, penetration. The soul and the spirit are described as things that can be separated, distinguished, dissected by a specific force. If they were the same thing, the metaphor would lose its meaning. One does not separate what is already identical. The Greek uses psyche for soul and pneuma for spirit, the same terms Paul uses in 1 Thessalonians, and the progression is revealing. The Word of God penetrates to where the human gaze cannot reach, to the boundary between what is universal in living beings, the nephesh, the psyche, the dimension of conscious experience, and what is specific to the human before the divine, the ruach, the pneuma, the spirit. The Eastern tradition of Christian thought, represented by figures such as John Chrysostom and Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th and 5th centuries, maintained a more careful distinction between the terms than the later Western tradition. For these thinkers, the human spirit was not merely a function of the soul, it was a distinct reality, the specific point of contact between the creature and the creator, the organ of perception of the transcendent, the image of God in the human being in the sense of a correspondence of nature that made communion possible. This notion of imago Dei, the image of God, runs through all biblical reflection on what distinguishes the human. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 describes God creating the human being in his image and likeness. The animals do not receive this designation. And what the biblical tradition understands by this is not intellectual capacity nor dominance over the natural world. It is a dimension of being that establishes relationship, that is capable of responding to the call, that can say, "Here I am," when God calls. The account of Genesis 2 articulates this with extraordinary precision when you read the original Hebrew. The human being does not simply receive the same nishmat chayim, the same breath of life, that animals receive indirectly through the general creative act. The human being receives the breath directly from the nostrils of God. The intimacy of this image is intentional. It is not a distant cosmological act. It is an intimate, close, personal act. And the result is a being who carries within himself something that has its origin directly in God, what the tradition called spirit. The practical consequence of this distinction is enormous. If the soul is the dimension of individual experience, emotions, desires, personality, memory, identity, then it can be affected, wounded, healed, transformed by horizontal things. Relationships affect the soul. Trauma affects the soul. Therapy works on the soul. Art feeds the soul. The dimension that Nephesh describes is responsive to the world of experiences, of stories, of human connections. But if the spirit is the vertically oriented dimension, the dimension that has a specific relationship with the transcendent, then it responds to a different order of reality. The human spirit, within the biblical framework, is not dead for lack of experience or relationships. It is dead or dormant or alive in relation to God. And no amount of horizontal experience, no emotional healing, no therapy, no relationship, no intellectual achievement directly accesses this dimension, because it responds to a different frequency. The Apostle Paul uses exactly this framework in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1, when he describes people dead in trespasses and sins. He is not talking about biological death. These people functioned in the dimension of nephesh. They had emotions, desires, relationships, projects. But Paul describes them as dead in the dimension of the Spirit, in the dimension of relationship with God. And in Ephesians 2, verse 5, he describes what happens when this dimension is awakened. God made us alive together with Christ. This distinction explains an experience that many describe but few can articulate. The experience of someone who has everything the dimension of the soul could desire: meaningful relationships, emotional health, purpose, stable identity, and yet experiences a restlessness that nothing on that list fills. Augustine of Hippo wrote in the 4th century a sentence that has crossed 16 centuries. "Thou madest us for thyself, and our heart is restless until it repose in thee." He used the Latin anima, soul, but was describing the phenomenon that the biblical authors attributed to ruach, the dimension that finds no rest in the horizontal because it was created for something vertical. The problem becomes even deeper when you examine what the Bible says about the destiny of the two dimensions. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 7 says that the spirit returns to God. The question about the destiny of the soul is more complex. The texts of the Old Testament use the term Sheol for the state of the dead, a place of silence, of forgetting. The New Testament enriches the picture with texts that describe the souls of martyrs as conscious and waiting in Revelation chapter 6, and the resurrection, a new transformed body, pneumatikos, as Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 15, is presented as the final resolution. The Greek uses soma, psychikon, for the natural body, literally body of the soul, and soma, pneumatikon, for the spiritual body, the body animated by the pneuma. The distinction between psyche and pneuma is embedded in the very distinction between the current state and the resurrected state. The question this raises for the linguistic archaeology of the sacred text is simple but profound. If soul and spirit were synonyms, all this textual architecture would collapse. The author of Hebrews could not speak of division between what is identical. Paul could not use both terms as structural contrasts within the same sentence. The prayer of 1 Thessalonians 5:23 would lose all its force. Three distinct words, pneuma, psyche, soma, asking for sanctification for three distinct dimensions. The repetition would be redundant, and the biblical authors were not redundant writers. This does not resolve the debate between dichotomists and trichotomists. One must be honest about that. The dichotomists have serious arguments. They point out that in many biblical passages, the two terms seem to be used interchangeably. In Luke chapter 1, verses 46 and 47, Mary says, "My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Saviour." If soul and spirit were radically distinct, the parallelism would not work that way. The dichotomists argue that the distinction, when it exists, is functional, not ontological. That is, it describes different functions of the same immaterial reality, not two separate realities. The trichotomists respond that Hebrew poetic parallelism, such as that which appears in the Song of Mary, frequently uses two related terms to emphasize a concept without implying absolute identity between the terms. just as heart and mind are used in an almost parallel fashion in many texts, without implying they are identical. The force of the trichotomous argument does not rest on a single text. It rests on the consistency of the pattern throughout the entire biblical library, and there is a linguistic archaeological datum that the trichotomists considered difficult to get around. Throughout the entire Old Testament, ruach is never used for animals in the same way that nephesh is used. Nephesh, as demonstrated, appears explicitly attributed to fish, birds, and land animals. Ruach, in its uses in the biblical texts, is consistently associated with God, with the human spirit, with wind as a metaphor for the divine, or with the breath of life in a specific sense. The linguistic dividing line between the two terms corresponds to the ontological dividing line that the authors seem to want to draw. King Solomon, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 21, makes a distinction that the trichotomists consider significant, who knoweth the spirit of man that goeth upward, and the spirit of the beast that goeth downward to the earth. The Hebrew uses ruach for both, but the movement is different. The human spirit goes up, the animal spirit goes down. The distinction of destiny suggests a distinction of nature, as if the same word pointed to the same category of existence, but the instances of that category had radically different properties. Job, in chapter 32, verse 8, articulates something that crosses the entire debate. Elihu, one of the characters in the book, says, "But there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth them understanding." Two elements in parallel, the spirit in man and the breath of the Almighty. Understanding the capacity for deep comprehension is presented as the product of the interaction between these two, not simply of intelligence, not simply of experience, but of a specific dimension within the human being that is in relationship with the divine source of wisdom. This places the distinction between soul and spirit within a framework that goes far beyond theological anatomy. It is not merely a matter of cataloging components of the human being as parts of a machine. It is about understanding that the human capacity for transcendence, for the search for meaning, for the experience of the sacred, for the perception of eternity within time, is not simply a more complex cognitive function. It is, within the biblical framework, a dimension of being, a layer of existence that was not produced by the evolution of intelligence, nor by the complexity of emotions. It was placed there by a specific act of direct transmission of life, the breath from the nostrils of God, in Genesis 2:7. And because it came from a specific source, it points, within the biblical scheme, back to that source. The writer of the Gospel of John in chapter 4, verse 24, records Jesus saying that God is spirit, and that those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. The instruction is specific. Worship is not an act of the soul. It is not merely emotion, not merely aesthetic feeling before the sacred, not merely intellectual assent to propositions about God. Worship in spirit is an act of a specific dimension of the human being in relation to the specific nature of God. The point of contact between the creature and the Creator operates in this dimension. Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, expands this framework with an analysis that anticipates by 2,000 years debates that neuroscience and the philosophy of mind have still not resolved. He distinguishes the psychikon man, the man of the soul, of the natural psychic dimension. From the pneumatikon man, the man of the spirit. The psychikon man, he says, does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him. They can only be spiritually discerned. The distinction is not one of intelligence. Some of the people Paul would include in the psychikon category were extraordinarily intelligent. The distinction is one of dimension of perception. Just as healthy eyes are needed to see light, and the absence of eyes is not the absence of intelligence, the spirit is needed to perceive a specific order of reality. Contemporary neuroscience has a name for the problem Paul was describing. The philosopher David Chalmers, in 1995, coined the expression, the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problem is explaining how the brain processes information and generates behavior. The hard problem is different. It is explaining why there is subjective experience, why processing information has a what it is like, an internal quality that you cannot reduce to neurons firing. Why does it hurt to be in pain? Why does red look red from the inside? Why is there a you reading this right now, and not merely a processor executing algorithms in the dark? Neuroscience maps the neural correlates of experience, but it does not explain why those processes are accompanied by experience. Chalmers, Thomas Nagel, John Searle, and Frank Jackson have worked on this problem for decades. They have not reached a consensus. The biblical texts do not solve the hard problem, but they offer a vocabulary that makes it comprehensible in a different way. Subjective experience, the what it is like of being you, resides in the dimension that Hebrew calls nephesh. And the question of why that experience exists, where it comes from, where it goes, why it carries a thirst for meaning that no experience ever fully satisfies, that question points to what Hebrew calls ruach, the dimension that not only experiences the world, but asks why the world exists. Now you are in a position to understand the distinction more precisely than most theological debates allow. The soul, the nephesh, is what makes you a specific, unmistakable individual, with a history, with particular loves, with particular fears, with a face that is the face of no one else. It is what animals have, each in their own way. The pet dog that recognizes you among thousands of people and comes to meet you with joy is functioning in nephesh. It has affection. It has affective memory. It has preferences. It has fear and courage. It has something that deserves to be called an inner life, within the limits of its nature. But the dog does not ask why it exists. It does not experience existential anguish before death. It does not compose music. It does not build temples to worship what it cannot see. It does not create philosophy to understand its own nature. It does not write sacred books trying to discover what lies after death. It has no memory of past generations it never knew. It does not project future generations it will never meet. It does not feel guilt for what it is not present to witness. It does not forgive. All these capacities, composition, worship, philosophy, the search for meaning, forgiveness, the projection of eternity within a finite existence, the biblical texts attribute to the dimension they call ruach, the spirit. And this dimension, they affirm, is not the natural product of the evolution of intelligence, not a cognitive function emerging from a sufficiently complex brain. It is the product of a specific act of direct transmission of life, the breath from the nostrils of God in Genesis 2:7. And because it came from a specific source, it points, within the biblical scheme, back to that source. The book of Genesis uses the word 755 times for nephesh, 389 times for ruach, and never, in any of these occurrences, uses the two terms as if they were absolutely identical. The variation in usage, the specificity of contexts, the progression of meanings, all of this suggests that the authors of the sacred text were not imprecise. They knew the difference between the words, and they chose each one with intention. Here, finally, you arrive at what makes the distinction between soul and spirit more than an academic debate. Genesis uses nephesh for the aquatic creatures in chapter 1, verse 20, for the birds in verse 21, for the land animals in verse 24, and for the human being in chapter 2, verse 7. The same word, the same compound, nephesh chaya, living soul. But between the creation of the animals and the creation of the human being, there is a difference of process that the text emphasizes with an image of intimacy that does not appear in any other creation. The animals come forth by decree, let there be. The human being is formed, shaped, receives the breath directly, face to face, nostril to nostril. And the result is not merely another Nefesh Chaya among the animals. It is something that animals do not have. It is a being who, across the millennia that follow, will build civilizations, develop languages, ask questions about his own origin, create art, write sacred books, try to understand what a soul is, try to understand what a spirit is, and never, in any generation, reach a complete consensus about himself. The Bible does not resolve the debate, it deepens it, and it suggests that the question about the spirit can only be asked by someone who already has one, because the dog sleeps, and you are still awake at 3 in the morning trying to understand why you exist.